Hello and welcome to our channel. My name is Usman. Today I'm going to be doing a relatively quick comparison between the Sigma 50mm f1.4 Art versus the Hasselblad 65mm f2.8. Now both of these are standard lenses, and although the focal lengths are slightly different, they do have a similar field of view because the 65mm lens operates on a larger sensor, a medium format sensor. Now between the two, the apertures are slightly different, so the depth of field is going to be shallower when shooting wide open on the Sigma, but we're not going to be testing every single thing between these two lenses. This is just a quick comparison, so I'm going to be looking predominantly at the sharpness at various aperture ranges and maybe briefly cover the color differences between both cameras and lenses. So I've got all the images on my computer. Let's quickly hop on and do this comparison. So here we have the images opened up in Lightroom now. The Hasselblad files are PSD files, as you can see over here, and this is because they were originally processed in Focus and then brought into Lightroom once exported with the settings in Focus. Now, I intentionally did not apply any lens profiles to them just so that you can see if there's any distortion or vignetting, which I'll briefly cover, but we'll discuss that as well. And the only thing I did in Focus was correct the white balance based on the color checker digital. Now for the Canon files, for some reason Lightroom keeps calling my lens the 50mm Tokina Opera. It's not the Tokina lens. This is definitely the Sigma Art lens because I know which lens I own. For some reason Lightroom wants to call it Tokina. I don't know why, it just annoys the hell out of me. But anyway, let's put these images side by side and take a look at what we can see. So first of all, aspect ratio is different. Canon files with that 3:2 aspect ratio is going to be a little bit wider, whereas Hasselblad with its 4:3 is going to be slightly taller, but field of view is relatively similar. Color wise, now I appreciate that Capture One, some people may say Capture One is slightly better in terms of colors, but I did look at the color difference between Capture One and Lightroom. There wasn't really that much in it. They both had that magenta cast to it, so that's why I decided to bring the raw files directly into Lightroom. It really didn't make that much of a difference. But anyway, the colors between the Hasselblad and the Canon, I mean, Hasselblad just does a much better job. The colors are far richer in tone, and this is something that Hasselblad does really well and has consistently done really well. I mean, if you look at the skin tone colors over here versus the ones on the Canon, you can see that the Hasselblad just does a better job. The red tones have more vibrancy in them, they're more richer, and they just look better overall. Now again, both of these have been white balanced correctly based on the color checker. And if we zoom in 1:1 into the center, you'll notice, once Lightroom catches up, you'll notice that the Hasselblad, when both are shot wide open, I mean obviously this isn't fair because this is f1.4 and this is f2.8, but still, when they're both shot wide open, the Hasselblad is noticeably sharper. But the difference isn't huge. Like, if you're looking at this section over here, yes, there's a definite increase in sharpness and contrast and clarity, but it's not a great deal in the center. Noticeable, not a huge amount though. However, as you start moving into the corners, the first thing you'll notice is that the Sigma does have some noticeable chromatic aberrations going on. I don't know if this is coming up in on YouTube, but I can definitely see some purple fringing going on, and also the Hasselblad is definitely sharper as you start moving into the corners, and pretty much every corner the Hasselblad is sharper than the Sigma. Now, with these kind of lenses, if you're trying to get shallow depth of field, then center sharpness generally tends to be more important. But, you know, for those of you who like to see some degree of corner sharpness, then, you know, the Hasselblad is going to be better in that regard as well. If you stop the Sigma down to f2.2, which then makes it equivalent in terms of depth of field, the Sigma does sharpen up really well. And it's very close. The Hasselblad is just slightly sharper, maybe just a little bit crisper in terms of some of the finer detail, but the Sigma and the Hasselblad are very close when you're at equivalent apertures. Even in the corners, the Sigma becomes a lot sharper and a lot of those chromatic aberrations tend to disappear. So at equivalent apertures, they're very close and very difficult to tell apart. And in real world conditions, you will not be able to tell the difference. So equivalent apertures, the Sigma actually does extremely well. Continuing with equivalent apertures, at f4 and f2.8, they're very close, although the Hasselblad does have that clarity, which the Sigma and the Canon doesn't. So if you're looking at this detail over here, yes, it is very, very sharp and you can pick out a lot of detail and it is extremely close, but the Hasselblad just has this certain level of clarity that the Sigma and the Canon doesn't. But again, in real world conditions, I bet most people, if not anyone, would be able to tell the difference in terms of detail and clarity. So on that basis, I'm going to say the Sigma is performing extremely well. However, the Hasselblad is just slightly better. Going down another stop, both of these lenses become pretty much on par in terms of sharpness and detail. Like, I really can't tell them apart. They're both extremely sharp. So f4 versus f5.6, equivalent apertures in terms of depth of field, and both of these lenses are extremely sharp, and they pick out a great deal of detail pretty much across the frame. Even in the corners, the Sigma and the Hasselblad are pretty much on par with one another in terms of performance. Going down another stop to f8 on the Hasselblad and f5.6 on the Sigma, this is where things get a little interesting, because when you zoom in, the Sigma is sharper. At f5.6 versus f8, which is equivalent apertures, the Sigma is noticeably sharper. Like, look at the detail over here versus there, and the Sigma is picking up more detail. This is the Hasselblad just has a little bit of fuzziness to it, which is not present in the Sigma. So at smaller apertures, when you're shooting equivalents, the Sigma is definitely sharper, which is quite surprising, because at the wider apertures, the Hasselblad definitely sharper. But as you start stopping down, the Sigma not only catches up, but exceeds the Hasselblad in terms of detail and clarity. And this remains pretty much consistent across the apertures. So f11 versus f8, you can see the Sigma is still sharper. There's just that certain bit of clarity in there that the Hasselblad is losing. So it looks to me like the Hasselblad suffers from diffraction far sooner than many other medium format lenses that I've shot with. Stopping down to f11 and f16, again equivalent apertures, you can see that the Sigma is still sharper. Diffraction comes in very soon for the Hasselblad 65mm lens. So for those of you that like to stop down, or maybe you're shooting products with this lens, I don't know, you might want to keep that in mind. For one reason or another, diffraction is setting in far sooner on the Hasselblad than it does with many other medium format lenses that I've shot with. Again, if you're looking at the detail between these two, the Sigma is definitely sharper at f11 versus f16. And finally, stopping down to f16 versus f22, the Sigma is still sharper, although diffraction is affecting the Sigma file as well. The Hasselblad file seems to be affected far more than the Sigma. So you can see the Hasselblad file is pretty mushy. It's not really anywhere near as sharp as it was around f4 and f5.6. So, the Sigma does hold up really well in comparison to the Hasselblad when you start stopping the lens down. In fact, even when you compare them at the same aperture, which is not equivalent, so the advantage is on the Hasselblad, but at the same aperture, the Sigma is still sharper. Not by much, but it's definitely sharper. There's just this little haziness to the Hasselblad file compared to the Sigma lens. So stopping the lens down, the Sigma is definitely sharper. However, at the wider end of the apertures, the Hasselblad is sharper. So it depends on which one you value the most. Of course, the Hasselblad does go all the way down to f32 as well, but I don't know how useful that's going to be for many people. I mean, at f16 versus f32, the Hasselblad is just, well, it's very hazy, lots of diffraction, and sorry about the dust on the sensor. I probably should have cleaned that, but doesn't really make that much of a difference. But in terms of like detail and clarity, like look at how much sharper this is in comparison to the Hasselblad between when the aperture's the smallest that the lens can produce versus the smallest aperture on the Hasselblad. Not saying that this is a fair comparison because they're not equivalent, but at the smallest apertures, the Hasselblad does suffer from a great deal of diffraction. So there you have it. That's how both of these lenses compare against one another. The Hasselblad is definitely sharper on the wider end, around f2.8, f4, definitely sharper. However, as you start stopping the lens down, the Sigma not only catches up, it starts outperforming the Hasselblad, which is quite surprising because generally speaking, medium format lenses are described as being better when it comes to diffraction, especially because of those larger elements. But that's not really the case in every situation. It is kind of like a case-by-case situation. Every lens tends to perform slightly different, and there's no set rule on where diffraction sets in for any particular lens. There's a guideline, but not really a set rule. And as you saw in this comparison, the Sigma is definitely better when it comes to diffraction compared to the Hasselblad lens, which is useful for those of you that want to stop down. Maybe you want to get more depth of field and more detail in an image. The Sigma is going to be a better option. And if you want that shallow depth of field with lots of detail, then the Hasselblad is going to be better when it comes to the wider side of things. However, in real world conditions, because the differences in a controlled environment was so subtle, in real world conditions, the differences are going to be negligible, even on the wider end of the aperture. And even when you stop down, the amount of detail that both lenses capture is going to be negligible. You're not going to be able to see that much of a difference, if any difference at all. But the biggest difference you're probably going to be able to notice between both of these camera systems is the color. Hasselblad colors are just beautiful, and they always do such a good job in that regard, and that's one of the reasons why I love Hasselblad colors. So overall, between both of these lenses, surprising how well the Sigma does, especially considering the price difference, but advantages and disadvantages on both sides. Anyway, just want to say thank you so much for watching our video. If you like this video, hit the like button, please subscribe, share this video, and hope to see you all in the next one. Thank you.